Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Owlverse podcast. A major part of Owlverse is the study and implementation of a therapeutic technique residing in narrative. Throughout life, personal experiences become personal stories, and through these personal stories, ideas about ourselves, the world around us, and how to live in the world are formed. Sometimes the story we are living doesn't actively serve us in a positive way, and when it doesn't, we often find ourselves immersed in a story we do not wish to be in. This technique of narrative therapy serves to separate a person from their problem. It encourages people to rely on their own skills to minimize problems that exist in their lives, and gives them the tools and techniques to write a new one. In today's podcast, we'll be reading from our last issue, A Beginner's Guide to Narrative Therapy Techniques. If you found what has been read here helpful, please let us know. Narrative Therapy Techniques. A major part of human history involves the development and sharing of stories. Dating back to the story of Gilgamesh in the 3rd millennium BCE and Marduk, possibly earlier from Mesopotamia, hero stories and myths have survived in human history to not only entertain, but to teach as well. These stories often involve the main character facing strife, setting out on a journey to find the answer to their problems, meeting teachers along the way, and eventually growing beyond what they foresaw possible into a better person. The explanation for these stories' survival and continued popularity throughout time is precisely for these reasons, because they show us a way to correctly live in the world and society in which humans find themselves in. This popularity can be seen in an overwhelming way in our modern times, through the grand proliferation of comic book movies being released every few months. Oftentimes, these contemporary iterations share obvious parallels to our ancient stories for these very same reasons. They give us an archetype to look towards, to strive to be, in order to better ourselves and our lives. This idea is deeply rooted in the practice and implementation of narrative therapy throughout each day. We are all living our very own story, from the moment of our birth to the end with our death. Each day we are contributing to the amalgamation of our story which will eventually make up our lifetime. How we interact with the other characters, what we learn, what we share, what we create, and a sense of totality, the meaning we assign our lives, is what will become the story we write. It is then of the utmost importance to see ourselves as a character and creator of our story, in order to change the direction of it when we are in the midst of one in which we deem undesirable. In order to do this, though, we need a set of guidelines to identify characters in our story, and eventually, what we need to change. A useful tactic to accomplish this is a set of questions we can ask ourselves systematically to clear the ripples of our time spent here in order to fully see the reflection of our faces in the timeline of our lives. The questions, as followed, can be used by everyone in order to accomplish this task. They include: 1. Name some people in your life who have opposed or attempted to thwart your plans. 2. Name some people in your life who have helped or supported you. 3. Who do you imagine to be judging you or evaluating you in your life? 4. Who are your favorite heroes and villains? And 5. If you were going on an adventure, who would you want as your trusty sidekick? As Louis Malmadrona states in his book, Remapping Your Mind, The Neuroscience of Self-Transformation Through Story, these questions aim to identify actual characters and their roles in ideal characters. The ideal characters begin to move us toward new stories that could be constructed. They give us some sense of who the person wants to be and who could oppose them, to give them even more strength as a character through being a worthy opponent. This is a very important point. As can be seen with almost every hero story, the main character, you, needs to identify their opponent and work towards overcoming them. This opponent may even live inside of you as a negative aspect in which you need to change to create a better situation surrounded by improved circumstances. In fact, this is often the case. But the point remains the same. We don't need to create a life that is easy. That is to say, we don't want a life without struggle, but rather one that involves struggle, but also includes the fortitude and character in ourselves to overcome it. That is the true path of the hero, and a path that universally lives in every human. From these questions, we then look to continue to develop the narrative of a person's life in order to identify high points, low points, and turning points, which certainly almost everyone has. We do this in order to create a clear picture of the type of character we are playing in our lives, so that we may begin to construct a new story in which to live in. Then, through the use of guided imagery, and storytelling, we can begin to create narratives that offer opposite conclusions from those which have formed the dominant plot of the story we are currently living. The key here is in our use of imagination. If we can begin to imagine alternate stories and alternate timelines, we can clearly construct what type of person we need to become in order to live a better life and start to implement these changes in our current reality. In order to start this process, it is helpful to begin with the questions already listed. From there, it can become clear what type of person we are, what type of people we are surrounding ourselves with, and what our idealized version of each can and should be. It is often the case that we fail to intelligibly view our lives from a distant perspective, and so we get stuck in not only the current story of our lives, but the character in which we are playing in them. And with this mindset, change is often regarded as impossible. However, human beings are malleable. We are not stuck in our lives, nor are we stuck in the way we act and perceive ourselves. We are always changing, and we are always growing, as evidenced from the earliest hero stories in existence. The trick is being able to see ourselves from this perspective and having the ability to implement changes once we have identified these key aspects. But once we understand this new perspective, in it lies the power of story and the power of narrative therapy.